The look on his face was so scary. You would have thought that I had threatened him with a gun or something extremely serious. He goes completely red in the face. He takes his eyes off of the highway where we're going 70 miles an hour, and he takes his eyes intentionally off the road with a dramatic turn of his head and just keeps his hands on the wheel and glares at me with a red face. And the intent behind that was, I'm not looking back at this road until you recant what you just said. And I'm looking at the road. We're starting to swerve off the road to the right. We're in the right lane. So we're starting to head toward the edge of the road. And I'm getting scared. And I'm like, he means this. And now this is no longer about belief. Now my dad is threatening me because I disagree with him. And so he quickly looks back at the road, but he had the sneer on his face, like, I scared her. Maybe that'll work. And now I'm getting mad inside. And I'm like, oh, I see what kind of a devil you are. I know exactly what you're trying to do. So I knew I had to proceed with caution, but he wasn't going to let this go. So normally I would have been quiet and not said anything, and I would have been like, this isn't even worth it. But he's not going to let this go. So now he begins to be a absolute bully and terrifying. And he begins to yell and slam the steering wheel while we're driving and take the steering wheel in both hands and yank it left and right and left and right. And before he did that, he purposely looked in his left and rear view mirror to make sure there were no cars around, because he knew what he was going to do before he did that. And he starts swerving. He says, and then he screams at me, do you know I could send you to heaven to meet the God that you're denying right now? You're so lucky I'm a good dad and I love you, or I could send you somewhere where you don't want to be. And at that moment, I realized he's a murderer. He is like a Ted Bundy. There's something about him that is extremely, extremely unhinged. And Lane is in the back, and I happen to glance in the rear view mirror because I'm in the front passenger seat, and he has these huge eyes. He looks so scared. And I remember Lane looking right at me with these eyes of help. What is going on right now? And I knew that Lane was like, there's something wrong with this person. And Jon then goes completely silent and he's breathing heavily. He's threatening me. And I'm just quiet because I'm going, okay, I don't want to poke the bear right now. And he then starts talking the entire next 30 minutes about why women aren't able to be human, really.
I am speaking with Nicole Uhler, the daughter of Jon Uhler, who is the subject of reporting that we have done at the distance. Nicole, thank you very much for talking to us. This has been quite a process for you, I know. And so I want to thank you on behalf of our listeners who are going to be taking in this story for your honesty and for your willingness to talk.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on, Matt. I'm excited, and it's a really amazing privilege to get to share my perspective. And I hope that I can help people that have been hurt and help um, give more information to the perspective so that, if action needs to be taken or whatever needs to happen, that can move forward. I'm the biological daughter of Jon and Patricia Uhler. I was born in 1994 in Southern California, and I am 30 years old now. So in the time from 1994 until the present, there are many different time periods and different chapters, I would say, that I've witnessed Jon go through, that I've witnessed both of my parents going through. And I would say my role in all of this, going through uh, the sort of trauma that I did, took the role of spectator. And I know everyone that goes through things handles their own situations differently. And so for me, I remember observing things almost from an outside perspective. And there were many concerning details that happened along the way that uh, need to bring Jon to justice. Trish herself um, had her own issues. She decided to take her own life. No one that I know was involved in that incident, but she decided that she did not want to be participating in life anymore. And so, unfortunately, we don't have a full circle perspective from her. I was born in 94. I have two younger brothers, and they both were experiencing things in different ways than I did. My middle brother experienced things the worst as far as the abuse in our household. My younger brother, you know, fortunately did not experience as much. But when it comes to what I've noticed from Jon, um, his beliefs started out more private and then they began to become more extreme and very much in a concerning way. I saw a lot of the stereotypical cult-like control grow in him from around the year 2000 until present. And a lot of megalomaniac behavior that, if you look up that term, just a lot of thinking that he's a savior, and inflicting his beliefs on other people that he claims to help. And so, what I was most concerned by, and my reason for wanting to speak with Matt once he asked me if I wanted to, was I will not tolerate someone that on the surface looks like a helper, but behind the scenes is someone who's actually hurting people and who lies and who does not hold the beliefs necessarily that he actually does. And as Matt may share, actually holds some quite dangerous and dark beliefs that he is not willing to reveal to people. And so my goal in coming on is to share the truth that I've experienced. And my ultimate goal is to hopefully speak and give some clarity on the confusion that's going on right now online, as well as the people that have been hurt. I saw so many things. I saw Jon would tell me things that he would tell nobody else, and so I have a very unique perspective in that regard.
So let's start not in your very first memories, but can you just sort of tell us generally, being young, before you are 10, when you are the age of a child who is not in control of their world, right? So
Mm,
you had that experience of being completely under the care and control of your parents as a young person, and your brothers are younger than you. What
mhm.
did you observe about Jon that you want people to know? And of course, Patricia's involved in this dynamic, so
Yes,
we're going to let the chips fall where they may. But what did you observe about Jon, who is alive and we need to know about?
their beliefs developed into such an extreme point of view and continued to develop. But going before age 10, I remember how I would describe Jon is someone who's very charming and charismatic, and someone who sounds very confident, very self-assured. He's one of the most determined and confident people I've ever met in my entire life. And behind the scenes, there was a tyrannical sense that's still there today, that anyone that disagrees with him on small matters, not just big ones, small matters, is going to be threatened, cut out of his life, and made to feel and use the name of God specifically. And a lot of people excommunicate family members in some cultures. But for my family, from my experience, my dad took a very extremist point of view where if you do not agree with him, he's going to damn you to hell, play the role of God, tell you what God thinks about you, tell you where you stand, how your life is going to go, and play the role of a lesser God. And as strange as that sounds, this whole conversations with Jon started when he was on a path to become a pastor. And because of some learning struggles that he has, he wasn't able to complete that. And so instead, with the help of Trish, he decided to become a counselor. And unfortunately, his motive for becoming a counselor was not pure. His motive was to be able to proselytize and share some very damaging beliefs that on the surface looked like he was helping people. But as you go deeper, and what I experienced and have heard from before I was born, and my many conversations with Jon, and what I experienced when I would witness him counseling, quote unquote, counseling people, and when I would hear stories from people who he counseled, was that he would start out seeming very warm, very friendly, very helpful. And then little by little, he would have an agenda, push them towards his beliefs. And that looks like saying things to them and saying things to me. Wouldn't have had us having this conversation if it weren't for God. God clearly wants me to say something to you. Um, God has placed me in your life for such a time as this. That's a very common phrase he says. God has placed me in your life for such a time as this. And it's up to you to see how much progress you want to make in your healing. He frequently uses the word of God in scripture as a weapon against people. And that's what I experienced. I was directed under both Trish and Jon to almost have a monk-like monastic study of the word of God since I was 6 years old. And it was very disturbing and extremely cult-like in the sense that Jon and Trish believed that this book, which I hold the belief it is the Word of God, but their personal belief was it's not just a religious book, it's the only book that everyone has to conform to, or they get to fall under a judgment that we're going to proclaim to them. We're going to say that they are worthless, that they're nothing. And so, up until the age of 10, I remember this extreme fear, this sense of uh, terror and a literal personal hell. My parents would convince me constantly. They constantly switched what they would say. They would say, God loves you, we love you. And then they threatened to make me homeless multiple times from the age of 8. Jon will deny that. And I want to put that on record. I know exactly how he thinks, and he will deny what I'm saying. But um, it's burned so clearly in my memory the day and where I was that I don't know how I would possibly make that up. The Pearl method has been exposed in some articles from Michael and Debbie Pearl. They're extreme fundamentalists who were abusive, and they're responsible for teaching a discipline method that is, quote, biblically based, and has been responsible for murdering multiple children. And my parents at first didn't subscribe to any specific belief in their discipline. They would just call it biblical child rearing. However, around 2002, early winter of 2002, my parents moved us from Southern California to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, they became part of some very extremist groups that are in central Pennsylvania who also hold the beliefs that my parents then subscribed to. So I remember there was a transition period from the time I was 8 until 10, where my parents began to look at how they could abuse myself and my brothers and people further using this Bible to tell people about the end of the world. And I, again, hold my own beliefs on that. But when you look at what a lot of these extremist groups believe, they believe that they have this special dominion over the earth. The documentary Shiny Happy People that went into the goth parents were a part of that. They didn't necessarily go to the conferences, but they were a part of that. And everyone I knew was a part of that. And the belief is that you have to dominate the world with your beliefs. You have to have a warlike perspective. And this is where I really want to say Jon has stated, and this is bold of me to say this, and I'm going to go there. Jon has stated behind the scenes that he believes that anyone that is in opposite, quote, biblical theology, biblical perspective, should be killed. And he stated to me, in honor, if there weren't laws in place in the government that we live in, to do it himself. And that kind of belief, I don't know how you can wrestle with claiming that you have the love of God and behind the scenes you're murderous. And I'm a very bold person. I don't mince words. And so my experience prior to age 10, living with Jon's parents in California, living with Trisha's parents, both of their families, and I did my own interviewing, and I secretly asked them questions, as well as Jon's friends, as well as Trisha's friends, trying to figure out what is this weird mix that I was thrown into. You know, as a child, you're born and you really have no idea about your family and what their beliefs are until you grow up. And so when I was around age 20, I asked them in a secret interview, and I said, "What do you remember about Jon and Trish? What did you notice about them? What has happened in that progression?" And their answers in both families were, "We don't know what happened to them. We remember that they always wanted to do things differently. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but they said their main concern was the way in which the beliefs were enforced. So Jon and Trish, one of their main reasons for cutting off both of their families, quite unhealthy people, but their reason was that they felt that they would spread dangerous ideologies and dangerous beliefs to us as children. And my dad would use that consistently, where we never had friends growing up, ever. Jon will again deny that. The only people we interacted with chose for us. So to quickly say, when my dad says, "No, we allowed you to have friends and people, it was people they picked for us," that they would say the Holy Spirit, God, told them were the best people for our lives. And quite frankly, Jon, inside of himself, genuinely believes that he speaks for God. Trish looked me in the eyes when I was 17 and told me, with a very scary look in her eyes and on her face, that she was actually the fourth member of the Godhead. And she meant it with everything in her. Jon has never said that, but the way that Jon holds himself, carries himself in how he treats others and what he believes is that he has some kind of special power. He has some kind of special destiny. And I think what I really want to narrow in on is there is a group of people that is extremely concerning, and Jon's not the only one. And they go under the guise of certain movements, and they will say they're anti this, they're anti that. And on the surface, some of us might agree with them. We want to support them. But you look at people, I'll just use some examples like Joshua Duggar, who is pro-life, and he's saying all of these things that I would support. However, there's a really dark side where he's into child pornography. And so I want to say people like Jon and like Trish and the people that they were a part of, the groups, they were not willing to share what they believed with the public. And so they had one face and they had another face. And what concerns me is a literal sense of terrorism. It's a terrorism in the name of Christ. So I was told multiple times from a young age, I would say age 3, that I was a quote warrior for Christ. And when I asked them, what does that mean? Their answer was, we expect you to be dangerous for God. We expect you to be someone that can take down anyone. Now, they didn't explain exactly how you would take down that person, but what I'm saying is Jon and these people that sometimes will call themselves a political term, they hold to this belief that they are really dangerous, but they're not going to let you know. And they are pushing an agenda that is either you believe how I believe, or we're praying that God hurts you. And so what I experienced as a child is constantly, almost on a daily basis, being threatened. Well, if you don't believe the way we believe, we're going to pray that God kills you. They actually said that. Again, Jon will probably deny that, but I know exactly what I heard. They said that to me, to my brothers. They would talk about behind the scenes after we went to some kind of a church function. They would talk about people. They would gossip about them. Jon is a big gossiper. He would talk about, well, if they don't choose to believe, then, God's going to do something. I'd be afraid to be them. And that was something he'd say frequently. And It was scary. I felt like I was being threatened, which I was. And I remember thinking that this wasn't God. I remember thinking that before age 10, they were using this belief system to harm and abuse people, which again is not unique, but for this group of people, this is what they're doing. So, focusing specifically on Jon, the beliefs are extremely concerning. He has a terroristic mindset, and is willing to use whatever means necessary, and I mean that, to force people and bully people. He's definitely, a pulpit bully. Um, and unfortunately, it's been sad to me to hear that other people have experienced that as well. So once again, my main motivation in coming on is I am not going to tolerate anyone, especially someone that I'm related to, mistreating people and lying about it. And so I hope that this perspective can give an eyesight into who Jon really is. That he's held these beliefs for a very long time.
Tell us about the trips to Walmart and the highway signs and the garbage. And this is a very strange story. And I think that it really sort of speaks to the dynamic that was going on between these two parents of yours. So if you could just talk about that for a moment.
My parents, in getting deeper into what we call fundamentalism, where someone who's a fundamentalist believes there's absolutes. They do not believe in uh, any that anyone is free to believe what they want. They believe that everyone has to conform. It's a sort of belief communism. And so the deeper they got, the more books they read, the more documentaries they consumed. I remember my parents ordering many DVDs, many types of media on the Illuminati. And not surprisingly, like a lot of people I knew, the Illuminati and these secret groups began to become very fascinating in an unhealthy way, and an absolute obsession to Jon and Trish and other people that I knew. Though I want to say Jon and Trish were some of the most extreme in this belief out of everyone that I knew. And Jon and Trish began to become paranoid of the things they were reading, and then especially um, some of the Illuminati literature uh, will state that there are certain technologies that monitor and observe. And I'm not going to comment on those. I have my own thoughts. But what Jon and Trish specifically were doing is they developed this paranoia that they were being watched and recorded at all times. And so with the Walmart incident, my parents had decided that the government was using large grocery shopping chains such as Walmart, and uh, in the rounded letters on their signs. So Walmart has a round A, two round A's. They were taught and they believed that those were where cameras were placed, and these were not just any cameras. These were the cameras that the quote FBI and CIA and darker government entities, and that is an unquote, were placed to watch and look at people's license plates and look at your face and figure out what you believed in so they could send you to extermination camps. What they did was they forced us to literally act like we were fugitives. And so we would pull into the parking lot. My parents would drive around for a few minutes, casing the entire parking lot, and find a parking spot completely as far away as possible. And then we had to get out. We had to keep our heads down so the quote unquote cameras could not see our faces. And we had to rush as quickly as possible into the store. And it didn't stop there because, according to them, there's more evils inside of this store. So when we were in the store, we had to, according to mostly Trish, but Jon did not protest this. Jon went along with this. We had to quickly go in a very sporadic, chaotic fashion through the store so that if anyone was, quote, following us, we could lose them and they couldn't find us. And you can hear the laugh in my voice because I know how ridiculous that sounds. And so we would have many frequent shopping trips as a family where we would go through the grocery section, and my mother would say, "Quick, I think I see someone following us. We have to go to the paint department. We can't let them find us." And I just want to say the amount of paranoia that that puts into you as a child. And that's really Jon and Trish and this movement. That's their goal. They're going to make people scared. So they're looking for a savior type. And Jon and Trish were more than happy to fulfill that role. And they would make frequent comments such as, "What would you all do without us? Aren't you so glad we're here? God has placed us here for such a time as this." They would use these key phrases. Um, and so Walmart became this place, any store became this place where you were being tracked. And they would tell us really scary stories about how they believed that stores would be shut down and we would all be held against our will and then taken to concentration camps. So you can imagine going to a store as as a kid. And then the signs on the highway, my parents, both John and Trish, one Sunday when I was 17, they decided that they were going to take these trash bags off of signs on the 219 South Pennsylvania Highway. And these trash bags were over these signs, and I still don't know what these signs are. They are color coded, and it has arrows, and it's color coded. It says blue way, brown way, red way, yellow way. And again, I have no idea what those signs are for, but John and Trish had decided that those signs were evacuation routes for people in the quote end times who needed to escape. But the most concerning thing was they believed that they needed to uncover the right color that led to concentration camps for Christians. And their goal was to uncover these signs, and they did. They stopped us on the highway. I was not a willing participant. They stopped us on the highway on the side of the road next to several signs, and John and Trish both pulled bags, which I'm pretty sure is illegal, off of these signs and were looking underneath, documenting where on the highway these signs were, what color they were, and their goal. And my parents both said, let's follow this to the end of the trail, even if it's in West Virginia, even if it's down south, um, because we need to know where these go and we need to save the churches from being taken to concentration camps. They would talk about how our car was being microchipped and being tracked. And there was a whole fascination with the biblical prophecy and revelation about the mark of the beast, the 666, and being chipped so you can't buy or sell. And so they invented what that was. And people to this day are still speculating about what that chip implant is. But they had decided that it was all sorts of different things and they would change what that was. But summarizing, there was no end to the suspicion. And I want to say where this leads is John and Trish. This makes sense if you studied hostage mindset. If you look up on YouTube people who deal with hostages, it's very common that some hostages whose personalities are a little bit more prone to believing this kind of thing. Lane is kind of like that. So my brother Lane, who's my second younger brother, he started to actually become so paranoid and to believe what he was being told that he not only actually started to show signs of insanity and had to go and be put into a mental hospital several times because he believed he was seeing things. And this is not made up at all. It was very scary. He started to lose his sanity. He started to have very erratic behavior because he was being taught that he had to act in a very strange way. He couldn't sleep at night. He couldn't eat. He felt he was constantly under threat. And I watched Lane, and this is so strange. I watched him go from the person that I knew, the brother that was had a sense of self, to deteriorating into feeling like a crazy person. And I'm just thankful to God that God protected me from that. But I watched Lane get into multiple situations because he thought my parents would approve of him finding things about the Illuminati. And Lane would spend hours, at this time, he was an older teen, researching about this. So John and Trish made him paranoid and caused so many psychological issues for him. And then and I want to keep him as private as possible, but I want to say what happened later on for him was directly a result, 100% directly. And Lena shared this with me personally, that they messed with his mind so much that he began to think that he needed to do some very extreme things. And I'm going to leave it at that. I'd like him to share if he wants to. The belief system that I've seen in other families that my parents associated with, and this belief system that there's this fear and this paranoia ruins people's lives and, quite frankly, makes them act like they're not human anymore. And so I don't think I need to share how that affected me personally, but what I will say is Jon still holds those beliefs. And I think this is really important to know because Jon does not share this anywhere that I'm aware of online. I think he knows he'd be taken down if he shared this. But I do want to say Jon is very secretive and selective about sharing about the Illuminati, about these secret subgroups that he believes are on the hunt for people. But behind this, him being pushy about you have to believe the same things is also this indoctrination that he's looking to put into people. And I believe that Jimmy Hinton, his ex-partner from Church Protect, will state the same thing, which is that Jon claimed, I'm here to expose the darkness of sexual predators. And then somehow Jon morphed into also, we need to monitor what the government's doing. And so Jon just took things in a whole different direction. So Jon is not going to be forthright. I don't know why he would be. It wouldn't be in his best interest in his mind. But really, there's a lot of scary stuff that he believes, and he will never share that. Um, and I want to throw in before I forget, Jon has always kept people as far away as possible so they wouldn't see what was going on. And Jon and Trish both never in my life have I ever heard or seen them have personal friends. They've never had personal friends because that would mean someone could see what was going on. Jon himself never went to counseling in any form, I believe, ever in his life. I could be wrong about that. If it was one time. Jon never went to counseling. So his own practice that he subscribes to. I mean, imagine a doctor never going to a doctor. Imagine someone who it's their profession, totally denying that they need that. So, and that's what Jon does. Jon has said on multiple occasions, well, everyone else needs that, but I've got God. I've got my Bible. I've got my own way, and this is a literal quote. I've got my own way of processing, and so no counselor can help me. And both my parents had this mindset, and I remember, and I need to say this because this is relevant to Jon's what Jon is saying. You'll see Jon say everyone needs counseling, everyone needs a good therapist, everyone needs a quote biblical therapist. Now, I do want to give a quick warning on here that when you have the term biblical therapist, that means a person that oftentimes actually supports staying in an abusive situation. And this has been well documented. Someone who's a quote biblical therapist that Jon is pushing people towards, because Jon will say he was quote taught by it's called the Masters University in California, part of the John MacArthur mega church. And the Masters University has video clips of very dangerous teaching that a spouse is to stay with a spouse that tries to murder them. Jon actually does hold to those beliefs. And so I feel the need to say Jon does not support women. And I want to talk about this for a moment because Jon targets females. He holds a belief that comes from these pastors that women are less than, that women were created by God to serve men, that women are to put up with abuse. He calls it, persecution, and that it's God is pleased with that. He'll say, if you're being abused, please call the abuse number. Please do this. But then behind the scenes, he says, if you ever were to leave that abuser, God would be displeased with you. If you ever were to do this, God would do this. And so he's scaring victims. And I also want to tie in the scandal that he had about 6 or 7 years ago, where he was saying that Jane Doe in John MacArthur's Masters University, there was a rape that occurred, and there was a horrible bunch of abuse that came out of those situations, and some women that were attending the seminary, and it was all over some news. And Jon decided to comment saying, if Jane Doe does not reveal her name, and if she does not speak to and name her abusers, then she's not legit, and she's probably just slandering, and we're going to discredit her. And then he went on to say, after people were commenting, saying, that goes against everything you're saying. You're preaching safety. You're saying your church protect. What are you doing? He said, well, no, no, no. It's just Jane has a responsibility on behalf of all the other victims to speak up so that she can be brave and can have this badge of courage and protect people, which is just insane. He is very angry if anyone speaks against something that he believes in. And so, what he really wanted to do, and this is important to know, is he was angry with that woman for coming forward and speaking about the abuse. And I heard him personally tell me that that was not her place to do that, that she was making these quote overlords look bad. And he shamed her and said, any person that would look to take down such an organization as John MacArthur or whoever it is acting in a very unholy and ungodly way, and God's going to judge them. And so, what he was saying in his comments, pretending that he didn't know what he was talking about, is anyone that speaks up actually needs to be known so we can attack them, so we can hurt them. And this is extremely dangerous. And I'm speaking to Matt right now, and this is the reason why I came on. Jon is actually saying, and there were people who were horrified that he was writing this, but they don't know this is what he really believes. And this is what I want to expose. Jon believes that a female, specifically a female, which, by the way, is why he deals with men who are sexually deviant. He doesn't want to touch women. He doesn't like women. And that's why he uses women. That's why I, as his daughter, and I don't consider myself his daughter, as his biological offspring, am speaking out saying he treated me as less than, and he spoke to me and told me I am less than because I am female. And because he has purported and put himself out there as a female counselor specifically, and I have seen him at every church we went to target women. Jimmy Hinton's mother, Clara Hinton, has talked to me, and I'm sure she has her own words to say about how he targeted her and her daughter. And it is just very scary. The patriarchal perspective of domination that goes right into the Pearl discipline method. It's a trail of domination, of abuse. And quite frankly, I'm going to say this, Jon's obsession with BDSM, Jon's obsession with very cruel and unusual forms of punishment, he's always been hyper obsessed about that. And I find that that is very telling on himself, that he actually enjoys knowing that there are evil people out there, and he decided to make a business profiting off of that. And so, getting to the nuts and bolts of this situation, Jon actually, I'm going to be bold and say this, Jon wants women to be hurt so that he can help them. It's that scary, and I cannot think of the term right now, it's that scary phenomenon where people will actually commit crimes so that they can look like a savior. And I cannot remember what that term is. But Jon does that. And he injures people, he hurts people, and then he blames them for their wounds. And not only that, he expects them to come to him for counseling and for help. So in Jon, quote, exposing, and again, I'm not giving my personal feedback on this. I just want to say from Jon's own mouth and his perspective, Jon loves that darkness of the sexual perversion that he speaks to and has all of these, quote, experts on. And his goal, surprisingly, is he wants to find the victims who have been abused. And he has done this. He has these wives on. He has these women who have been hurt, and that's how he decides he's going to make money. And just in case he denies this, because I know he will, I want it to be on the record that he has told me personally when I was around 20 or 21 in my apartment that he wants to find more victims because it's amazing that he gets the chance, quote unquote, to help them and provide them a unique opportunity that only God has given to him. So he's taking on this role of prophet. He's taking on this role of I'm a miracle worker. And so at the end of the day, I'm his daughter speaking out, but at the end of the day, I'm extremely concerned for people like Jon who go looking for victims. They go looking on the blood trail, and then they view that as a way to make money. And that is so wicked and evil. I can't begin to describe the horror that I feel that anyone would use someone's private sexual trauma to exploit them. And unfortunately, and I want to speak to the people if they are listening who have been on his podcast, unfortunately, he views you as a story to make money off of. And I commend you, and I'm so proud of you for being willing to share your story. And I don't want you to feel like it wasn't worth it. I hope it helps people. But just so you know, I would not go on Jon's podcast. Jon is going to use that not because he cares, but because he views that as a stepping stone to saying, here's my website. And he does this all the time. If you follow his online presence on now called X instead of Twitter, he will constantly direct people and say, if you want counseling, if you want help. And unfortunately, there are several people who have very positive things to say because he advised when they were in a rough spot. And they unfortunately have been deceived into thinking, because he does portray himself that way, that he's there to help when he's actually not. And I've seen this over and over where he at home would actually talk about his plan, as strange as that sounds. He would talk about how he was going to get that person to trust him. And he would have a very specific method. And so this is what he does. His pattern, because it's really important. Jon will actually say this. It's very important to know an abuser's pattern. How he operates is he gets you to talk all about yourself. And that comes across as he cares. And so he gets you to talk about everything. And then he starts to get deep and uncomfortable. And unfortunately, not enough people seem to have good personal boundaries, and they start sharing with him very private details. So I would caution anyone who's talking with him, I wouldn't share personal details with someone like that, because he will exploit your personal life. He will share that with other people. He does not keep things in confidence. And what I experienced is I would tell him something private many, many times, and that would go public. And people would know about it. And then other people who told him things, he would share with other people. He's a gossiper, he's a backbiter and a slanderer. And I have no shame in exposing him for that, because he's the one that should have shame. So the people that are being interviewed by Jon are unaware that their stories are being used as a sensational headline that is kind of like a National Geographic post. He's wanting to say, look who I saved, look who I helped. I'm going to get that notoriety. And I'm going to be bold and say it is malpractice. His licenses that he has had, multiple licenses that have already been revoked, the ones he currently may still have should absolutely be revoked. No one should be practicing. Once again, he holds to the Master's University and a common, and I cannot remember the term, it's called family and biblical counseling. And this is very common among many, many churches, countless churches, where they're counseling victims to stay in abusive situations, and they're guilt tripping them under a spiritual message. And Jon believes that. And so I just want to say, when someone is claiming to help someone, I would hope they would be transparent about their belief and their intent. And Jon believes, again, women are less than. He believes that women need a man's help. And what do you find in these biblical counseling, quote unquote, circles? It's only men, because women are taught that they have a God-given position to not have any kind of, quote, authority. So Jon has an obsession with authority. Jon has an obsession with power, with domination, with control. And when you watch his videos, if you really start to look for that, you'll see it. You'll see the way he holds himself, the way he talks, the way he dominates people on his show. I hope people have noticed that. He comes across as very confident, but it's all a fake. And what I saw behind the scenes is he's not actually that confident. But if you get on his wrong side, if you get on the side as Jimmy Hinton experienced, he's going to scream at you. He's going to yell at you. He's going to say very scary things, such as, I hope that you die. I hope that God decides to end the miserable wretch that you are. And I've heard him say things like that. Um, so Jon does not know when to put the brakes on. But going back to him as a therapist, quote unquote therapist, he is supporting and he is subscribing. And if he had his way, if he was in charge, he and all of these men like him, they want to be able to say what should happen to victims. They don't want them speaking out. And so let me make this clear, as someone who has looked into this world of darkness that I've come from, and the countless men who believe they're entitled to tell victims what to do with their lives. And that includes for anyone in the community of sexual identity. What they really believe, they'll say, well, this is biblical truth. But what they believe is we should get to tell you what we approve of and disapprove of. Many of them believe in the death penalty. Many of them believe that if you act a certain way sexually, even privately in your own home, I'm not talking to people that are have committed sexual crimes. I believe that there should be severe punishments in place. But I'm talking to people who look at pornography, who are doing things in their own home that may not be affecting other people. They believe that the death penalty should be in place, but they won't share that. So Jon his counseling method, and I know this because he had every Dr. Dobson book under the sun that has ever been written. He had our basement was filled with at least close to 100 books that were very concerning. And this is where he gets his counseling from. He received several different schooling experiences. One was at Biola, which has had exposure and has had issues in the past. One was at Talbot University. And there are several that are known for having a counseling program, and they should never be licensed to do that. So John's start in the late 80s in becoming a counselor and becoming a therapist already had problematic outcomes. And I want to say, as do many, many of these men who are in churches, as do many of these people who claim to be safe people. And so I just want to say the best advice is find someone who's actually a licensed therapist and counselor who can help, who has experience in trauma. John is definitely not one of those people. He thinks he is. John did not have all of the experience that he claims to have. I'm not saying that some of it isn't true. Some of what John says is true. So John was at two different prisons in Pennsylvania. One was at Cresson in Pennsylvania, and the other was at Somerset. Um, John worked with, and I personally know, I would ask him, I was a bit of a very traumatized and curious child. And so the way that I handled my trauma was trying to get on my dad's good side. And it sounds very strange, but what I would do is every single day I would ask him how his day was. I would ask him what his day was like, who he talked to, who he counseled, what he did. And someone's first thought might be, well, that's not appropriate. You don't tell a child that. And that's exactly right. But that's what John did. So, fortunately for me, standing in this position now, I get to share. I know everybody that my dad talked to. I know everything that he did because I would ask him every single day for 11 years what happened. And I know the units that he was on. I know how many people he counseled, quote unquote. I know what his groups were like. I know the people in cages, all the stuff that's been talked about. I know exactly what has happened. And my memory might be a little bit foggy in the exact numbers, but I want to say John has overinflated his experience with sexual predators. Now, John did work with thousands of inmates, and that is true. Um, However, he worked with many who were mental health inmates. I can think of several that John worked with long term. Um, John's experience with the mental health inmates would often look like one-on-one conversations in his office. Uh, Part of John's job at Somerset was to evaluate inmates who had been incarcerated for quite some time, and they were being evaluated whether or not they were eligible for parole. Certain inmates could be eligible after a certain amount of time. So his one of his jobs was to screen inmates, and this is where it begins to become problematic. John was hired for one of the primary purposes of screening inmates to see if they would be safe to be out in the public, to be able to be on parole. Well, instead of doing what many of the therapists in his prison did, and to my knowledge, he had about 7 or 8 other therapists that he was on staff with at the time. Um, they would have the inmate in, they would ask the inmate questions, and they would see, does this inmate seem to be aware of not committing crimes and safe to the public? John took it in a whole different direction. Um, John, and I'm going to be bold and say this because I know that this is something that needs to be shared, and I can already feel that John is going to possibly, and I want to say this, possibly try to sue me, that this is something that is very serious. And this is, I will say this is an allegation simply to protect myself, but it's more than an allegation, but I'll stick with that. Uh, for years, since the time I was around 11, which is when John started working at Crescent, John would bring home personal documents of inmates. And those looked like their personal files that were on the computer system that John accessed as part of his job. Those looked like the court reports from the trials and the hearings of inmates. This looked like bringing home the crimes that they committed. John was fascinated more than almost anyone I know. It was kind of like a Dateline experience growing up with John. It felt like I was in the middle of the strange Dateline. John brought home hundreds over the 11 years that he was with the two prisons of personal private documents explaining, and showed me, showed my brother, showed my mom, and then would tell people at church, would tell people, and then he would use those documents to say why he was qualified to start and talk about church abuse. And that's extremely concerning because that's already illegal. So I want to make this clear. Jon was already doing illegal action to be able to have these experiences. And then what he would do, as strange as it sounds, I remember seeing him sit at his desk, by the way, instead of being a good dad to us, as he claims, this is what he was doing for hours and hours and hours. He would sit at his desk with these reports, and he would take quotes from the reports and write them on his websites as, this is what an inmate said that I told him. And he would use the information in these reports to show how, quote, devious these inmates were. There was a variety of different kinds of inmates. There wasn't just one kind. And he would try to create this collage of, these are the people I worked with. So already you have a foundation where Jon's not afraid, and he knew it was illegal. By the way, I have to say this. Jon would sneak them in his coat. So Jon would wear a large overcoat with pockets, and he would wear it even into like May. So in Pennsylvania, it's not cold enough for a coat. He would wear this giant overcoat as a disguise for what he was really doing. He would even call it contraband. He would refer to himself. This is just gold right now. He would refer to himself as the mole. And that sounds insane. He gloried in this. Again, you talk about the Illuminati fascination. He finds it fascinating to be this quote unquote spy, and has this complex where he enjoys that. And so he would wear this large overcoat and he would stuff the things he brought home. And he was going through, people might say, well, wasn't he being searched and checked? People who work at prisons know that. Yes, he was. And they never detected anything. They never detected the papers. They never detected any of that. I mean, it's not meant to detect papers. He would even not staple them so the metal wouldn't set off the detectors. So he was bringing these papers home, hundreds of them, every couple weeks, every couple months. He was showing them. I was reading them. He was telling inmates personal stories. He was telling them outside of our family. And then what happened was, that was happening at Crescent. Then there was a situation with abusive inmates. To my knowledge, from what Jon has shared and what has come out about that with Jon's boss, Jim Harrington, and the lawsuit that happened, the staff at Crescent were abusing mental health inmates. And this is not a comment, by the way, on Jon, positive or negative. From what Jon has shared, Jon spoke out and called and reported that behavior to a reporter. And I remember that conversation. I remember being in the house when he talked to the reporter, and the story went viral, and that prison was shut down. Again, I do not want to give Jon credit. I'm not trying to paint him in a positive light, but I'm just saying the facts. That prison got shut down because of the mass staff and guard abuse that was happening. That's why Jon transferred to Somerset. So that's simply not to make a comment. It's just to segue into why he was transferred. So he and one or two of the staff members in the psychology department at Crescent were transferred to Somerset. And because Jon had worked at Crescent for about 5 years, so he worked total between two prisons for 11. So now he's about halfway through his time. He then was transferred to several different floors. I don't know what to call them, but floors of the maximum security units on at Somerset. And so he first was working, I think, with the general population in the maximum security. I know I'm using the wrong terms, but he was working and he was doing his rounds. So the therapist would meet with inmates personally one-on-one. They would have group sessions once or twice a week. And the sessions were supposed to be about rehabilitating certain eligible inmates into the general population, kind of like an Alcoholics Anonymous group meeting for inmates. And so these were the inmates that were more maximum security. And so they had the state had these programs put in place where if a man wanted to become eligible for parole, he would have to undergo these sessions. So Jon was in charge of that. He also was put in charge of the mental health unit, where he worked with inmates that had some serious mental health challenges. And so John was also placed in several other, I think he was in about 5 or 6 different, again, it's not, the word department is not correct, but different types of departments within the maximum security units at Crescent and Somerset. Now, I will say, when it comes to sexually deviant predators, I'm going to reframe it and say John's partly telling the truth and partly not. John did work with many inmates that were specifically committed to prison and found guilty on charges of gross sexual misconduct and murders and rapes. And so that is true. However, John's groups that he would have, as he claims and has put online, were not specifically for sexual offenders. There were sexual offenders in the group. And I will just say, it's very scary to me that some of these sexual offenders were being eligible for parole, but that's another topic. But he had these men in his groups, and the men that were more dangerous would be in the cages. So I just want to explain this because John explained this, and I've had other people that worked in prisons explain this to me. So the cages that you find in some of these rooms that are in the more maximum secure units are for men who are known to cause trouble, they need a cage for a reason. And then there's men who sit on the floor in front. It holds usually about 12 people, so it's not a very big room. And from what I've explained for years is these groups were supposed to have a state informed curriculum. And there was a guard that was in the room at all times. And so the guard would stand at the door, and you would have about 12 inmates, and you would have about 4 sometimes who were in these maximum secure cages, and sometimes none of them were. So on average, we could say, if we're doing the math, he's meeting with about 36 people a week, so 36 inmates. And after they graduate the programs I think were about 8 to 12 weeks, so it was about 3 months. He would get a new round of inmates as long as they graduated. So when John is claiming to work with, I think it's 11,000 inmates that he's saying, he did work with around 11,000 inmates, but he didn't work with that many sex offenders. So I want to say, yes, his numbers are correct, but he's overinflating the population type that he worked with. Now, the problem, again, he was not following instructions. He was not, and he was sneaking. He admitted to that. So John's job, just like all of the other members on staff, was to meet with these inmates in groups and privately. And the groups were supposed to be around this curriculum, and they were supposed to talk about that week's topic. And what John would do is he would take the topic, he would have the material, and then he would completely go off script. And he was very proud of this fact. And he would even reenact at home, given that he thinks he's so special, he would reenact what these groups looked like for us. And he would start sharing about religious personal beliefs. He would start diagramming how their life could turn around with God. And he would start talking about how he was placed here in their life for such a time as this. And he would start talking about what he calls the path, which comes from the Bible. But he would then go off script if they were talking about, let's say, safety and how you conduct yourself. Instead of talking about that, he would turn it into talking about sin and talking about personal accountability. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I'm just saying it wasn't what the curriculum was. And John did this every single meeting. It was every single time. And I know that because he would tell us. So he would change what they were supposed to be talking about. And then when he would go one-to-one to either the cells of certain inmates that weren't allowed to come to groups, he would, you know, he also wasn't doing what he was hired to do. So it was, again, a lot of proselytizing. It was a lot of also asking them personal questions. And this is the thing, is John would try to get into the inmate's personal life, which I know is absolutely illegal and forbidden. If you look at any job position, it's written in bold that you are not allowed to fraternize with inmates. So he was doing that. He was fraternizing with inmates. He was asking them about their personal details that had nothing to do with his job. And then when he would meet with them one-on-one in his office, it got even crazier. So because he knew he wasn't being observed, so in the group settings, there was a guard. In the rounds that he would do on the floors with the men that were still in their cells, there were guards. So he was being observed. So when he got the inmates into his office, this is where he would really go off script. So he would have a giant whiteboard, And instead of talking with the inmate about what it is they were supposed to talk about, he would diagram for them and actually write out these very complicated boards of their life. And he would, in order to say, this is the life path God wants for you, and this is what I want for you, and this is how I can benefit and help you finding the right life path for you, which isn't even therapy, and that's what he was doing in his private sessions. So in his private sessions, he was going overtime, by the way. He was late meeting with many inmates because he took too long with some of them. Some of them, they had hard stories, and so he wanted to listen, and I think that can be a good thing. However, there were other times where he was proselytizing for so long, like an hour and a half, that he would be late and he wouldn't get his caseload done, and he wouldn't stay on track with what he was supposed to be doing. So when the inmate would come in to the office, he was using that as a time to proselytize instead of a time to talk about the facts. And he would do a little bit of that, but it was definitely not what the state had hired him to do. And then the incident specifically that got him fired from Somerset. Jon told me all the details. I know exactly what happened. And again, Jon's giving part truth, part not. So Jon had been going through a lot of personal things with Trish, and he wasn't handling family stress well. He wasn't dealing with the family issues that I had brought to his attention, and we'll talk about later. He wasn't handling those well. So he was letting that affect his work life. And he was getting 3 to 4 hours of sleep a night because he was working on his businesses. He was working on his websites. He was working on things that are not to be part of a therapist's life when they're devoting their time. So he was already driving an hour, on 3 or 4 hours of sleep, which is extremely dangerous. He was spending a whole day doing all of these things he's not hired to do. And then he was starting to really not handle his job well. So I remember seeing him get very angry. He was starting to lose his cool a lot. He'll say it was because of family issues, but that's not actually true because he could have handled them in a much different way. And so he was just snowballing over about 4 months. It was from, I would say, like December of 2014 until around April or May of 2015. And so he was just spiraling. It was pretty concerning to me. And I kept telling him, why don't you get more sleep? Make sure you're taking care of yourself. And he wasn't willing to listen. Um, so I remember the day that he came home and told me what he did. And he walked into my apartment in Somerset and said, I did something today that I think I might get in trouble for. And I remember thinking, this isn't appropriate for you to be telling your daughter. But, I was like, okay, I'll ask because I feel like it might be important in the future for me to know. And I'm glad that I do know so I can share this with you all. And so I said, well, what happened? And he says, I was so tired and I had met with some inmates earlier in the week or a week or two ago, and I forgot to have them sign after I met with them. And so I went ahead and I signed their signatures for them. And I got big eyes because I was like, oh my gosh, she just committed forgery. And I knew that was a huge, I mean, you're a therapist committing forgery in a prison. No one needs to tell me how serious that is. And so I said, you did what? And he goes, yeah. He goes, it was 3 or 4 signatures. And I just decided that I don't want to risk losing my job. So I just signed them because I didn't want to lose the job. And I obviously was rebuking him, saying that's wrong. And he said, I know that was wrong. I wish I hadn't done it. That wasn't right of me to do that. But I was like, well, you can't take that back now. Like there's evidence. Now you've committed an actual crime. And the sense that I got from him is that it was hope against hope, fingers crossed that he didn't get in trouble. Now, to give some backstory, simply because Jon is going to say this, and I want to give my own context from what I know really happened, Jon will say his family life was so tumultuous just for the kids. He wanted to be a good dad. He didn't want to cause things to get worse. He wanted to support his family. So he did everything he possibly could to make sure that we wouldn't lose our home, that we wouldn't. And keep in mind, by the way, Jon had blown all of his money and was severely in debt because he didn't manage his finances. And so that was also leading to the stress. So what really happened was had he had some situations at Somerset. And I will say there was a lot of very toxic interactions going on between the guards and Jon, between the staff and Jon, and some of that was not Jon's fault, and I want to say some of it was him standing up for certain inmates that were being abused. And again, I'm not commenting on that in a positive or negative. And so he was receiving, he was starting to be targeted because they hated certain inmates, and there was just a whole kind of war going on, a turf war within Somerset. And so Jon got in the middle of that. And again, I'm not saying this to positive or negative, but what ended up happening is that uh, the staff started to the staff started to dislike Jon because he was protecting certain inmates that they disliked, and it became a whole issue that got quite dangerous. And so now the staff at Somerset is trying to find every single excuse possible. And Jon would come home and say, I found someone in my office, or I found my computer taken and missing. And it was a domination show to say we're watching you. So that was already going on. And then things kind of settled down. And then Jon got careless and he decided to commit that illegal action. And I remember telling him, they're watching you. Why would you do that? And by the way, he because he knew he was being watched, he had stopped bringing things home, and he had stopped using company time, which he was using hours, 4 to 6 hours, to build his websites in his office when he was supposed to be meeting with inmates. He was using company time, and he was hoping he wouldn't get found out. And so his computer being taken was oftentimes a sign of shaming that he was looking at child porn. And so I want to clarify that I firmly believe that's not what was going on. So the prison had their own issues going on. But ultimately, Jon, even though he knew he was being scrutinized and they were hoping to fire him for supporting these inmates and trying to help them with being abused, and again, not saying positive or negative, just saying that's what was going on, um, he then decided to not finish the job and to forge the signatures. And I just remember thinking, what kind of a person does that? You know that you're being scrutinized, you're under the clock. So what he will say is that he's innocent. He did everything possible to support our family, to be a good therapist, and he'll say, it wasn't really my fault. He will say, yes, this happened, and he'll admit that, but he's not fully admitting it. So I just want to say, the reality of what happened was he got cocky, thought he could sign the signatures. He wasn't using his time, how he was being paid wisely. He was wasting company time. He was using company property. He was taking company property. And again, all of the businesses that he was building for years, he was using the time at his work to build websites and to build businesses. And he told me he would use track blockers, which I'm pretty sure are illegal. He's not allowed to be using those. He would do hidden incognito tabs on Google, and he would hide his tracks, which is silly because they can still track you. He just wasn't smart enough to realize that. So he would open up incognito windows. And then he said if anyone came in his office, he told me he would quickly click out of it so that no one could find it. So when it comes to the intention, he was absolutely trying to be covert. He knew that he was doing illegal action. Um, and so when it came to him being fired, that was no surprise to me. And the other conversations that we had, I told Jon, I was like, well, what do you think is going to happen? He said, I think my license will be taken away and I'll be suspended. And I said, are you sure we're not fired? Like suspended? That doesn't sound like what they would do. So sure enough, he gets a letter. I remember him opening it. They said, we're firing you. We know exactly what happened. And then later on, I think the state sent him a letter saying his license was being suspended. He was allowed, which surprised me, he was allowed to have $1,000 in um I'm using the wrong term. It was like a retirement amount that he got if he was let go. So it was $1,000 a month. That's what he got. That's what I think he will get for a very long time. And and then he went to court, and I wasn't part of that situation. I did have files on my computer that he's actually sent me and asked me to help him with that case. And I helped him a little bit with the paperwork, and now I would say, absolutely not. You are going to deal with this and I'm going to expose you. At the time, he was still living with me, and he was um, threatening me that God was with him and that if I didn't support him, things would happen. And the whole situation with my mom committing suicide and me having to take care of my brothers, that was why I wasn't exactly in a position. My dad was giving me money to help take care of them, and that's why I felt like I couldn't stand up to him. So I just want to clarify that and say now I have no contact with Jon, and this is extremely important for me to make clear. I refuse to have contact with Jon. He actually was the one that cut me off after screaming at me full throttle during a conversation in which I called him because he wasn't talking with me about prior issues with boundary setting. I set some healthy boundaries. By this time, I'm 24, I'm married, and I'm fully an adult living on my own. I had for several years after he abandoned us. And so Jon screamed at me because my new husband and I were going through getting on our feet after getting married. It had been a month after we got married, just to give some context in 2018. And my husband had been going through some challenges with his employment. And so I had to hold off on making car payments, and Jon had given me his broken down car that I was supposed to make payments on. So he'll paint this as my daughter was ungrateful. I just want to say he gave me a very dangerous car that actually almost killed my husband and I, according to the mechanics. And so he was having me, the car was still in his name. He was having me make payments on his behalf, so he didn't have to do that. And I was behind only $200. It was 2 months, $100 each. And he screamed at me because he said I was bankrupting him. This is in his words. I was, quote, bankrupting him. I was stealing from him and his new wife. That those are his words. I was stealing from my younger brother. And I asked him, I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm giving part of the $1,000 retirement from the prison to your younger brother. And the context is he abandoned my younger brother and forced him to live with Trish. And there's a whole situation with that. But Jon makes it look like he was self-sacrificing when really that's the least he could do, considering he didn't provide and had my younger brother was underage when he ended up being abandoned. And so any dad would think that that was an extremely poor excuse, but not Jon. So he yells at me and says, "You're making your brother poor. You're going to endanger him," because he knew that that would tug on my heartstrings because I care about my brothers, and he knew that that would make me feel guilty, and I wasn't having it. And I said, "Wait a second." I said, how could $200 make you be in such a terrible position? And it was at the point in my life where I'd already had some distance and boundaries. And so I knew he was trying to shame me, and I knew that I had to push back. And so he then screams, and this surprised me that he was this bold to say it. He goes, what am I supposed to work at Walmart? Someone of my caliber and degree? Can you imagine me changing trash and cleaning toilets, doing something so beneath me? And I was just standing there going, wow. For years, I sensed that level of pride, and it was actually really refreshing to finally hear that. That's the last conversation I ever had with Jon. I texted he and his new wife, Susan, and I said, you will not ever talk to me like that again. You have taught me to not ever let someone yell at me. You have taught me to not ever let someone verbally abuse me. And I'm putting you on notice right now. If you are not going to own up to what you did, we are not having any further contact. Wife, Susan, who clearly was talking with Jon, wrote back, shut up, Nicole. And then Jon, I did not read his text because it was extremely hurtful. And the first two lines were, how dare you, as my daughter, you know exactly what you did. And I just didn't read the rest of it because it wasn't worth my time or emotional damage. And so that's the last contact I had. And that was in 2019. So for him to take my private photos, my brother's private photos. And before I get into that, what he just did on the X website, Twitter, for Father's Day, Jon has never met his very first grandchild. I went through a pregnancy completely without my dad and had no support. My dad never, ever, ever paid for my wedding at all, even though he told me growing up that he would be happy to help contribute. He never told me, and I had to fund my wedding completely by myself with minimum wage job. He never gave anything. He never was involved in any way, shape, or form with my son. And for years, he would tell me, I can't wait to be a grandfather. I can't wait to be a such a good grandfather to your child, which was very creepy in the way he said it, because I know exactly what your child's going to need. And he would talk all the time about how his parents did parenting wrong, and that's a whole other subject. But for years, all he would tell me is, my parents really blew parenting. I can't wait to be there for you. I can't wait to be the dad that you need, and the grandfather to my grandchild. And where is he? And where he is doing what he always does, where because I won't believe the exact same things as him, and I'm not talking about major, I'm talking about minor. If I don't have the same friends as him, if I don't, basically, it's an incestual relationship. And I want to throw this in there. In addition to Jon viewing females as he deserves to have this like parasitic relationship, this incestuous, parasitic, maggot-like relationship where he's going to suck you dry. And it's very scary. What he did to me was absolutely not physically, but I wouldn't be surprised at this point if Jon were to try to have done that when I was a child. But he did not ever put his hands on me in that way. But besides the physical beatings, but I want to say, um, Jon was always, and he wasn't this way with my brothers, extremely emotionally incestuous with me as a child, very much so, more than other accounts I've heard of emotional incest. He would tell me about his sex life. He would tell me about the marital struggles going on, even though I had to bring them to his attention. He would tell me, I'm so glad I have you because if I didn't have you, what would I do? Which was so damaging. And he said many emotionally incestuous things to me. And I know he knows exactly what he's doing because on his YouTube channel, you will find several videos on parenting where he states if a parent were to ever say to their child what Jon said to me, such as, I'm so glad I have you. What would I do without you? You're better than your mother. You are the person I rely on. Thank you for being there for me. And parentifying the child. Jon has stated in multiple videos, if any parent ever does that, they are wicked, they are evil, they are parasitic, they are not a parent, they are abusive, and they are someone that is a very dangerous person. And that child, it is in their best interest to cut off all contact with the parent. So I will say, if Jon is ever listening, Jon, I followed your advice. That's exactly what I've done. You're a dangerous person. You know exactly what you've done. You speak out of both sides of your mouth, and you're quite the snake. And I have received, and I have to say this, I have received such healing, such freedom from coming out of that evil relationship that Jon had me in. And I want to be a brave survivor and say it is by the real God's grace that I'm standing here. The amount of times I was suicidal because of Jon, I have told him that. And I want to say this, I texted him a year and a half ago. It was a moment of traumatic, working through the trauma impulse. And I thought, I want him to know. I don't even want to hear anything from him. I just want to tell him, you made me suicidal. You damaged me unbelievably. So you lied to me about God. You are a fake. You are a fraud. You hurt our family. You're responsible for my younger brother going crazy. You are the reason why people are hurting. And I never looked at the text reply except for the first line as it shows on your phone. And it was, wow, what a thing to say to a father. You're such a fake. And I didn't read the rest. I'm so glad I didn't. And I just want to say, I told him everything. And his response to that was, you're a snake. You're disgusting. Get away from me. I don't ever want to talk to you again. That's actually what he was saying. And every day I was there for Jon every day. And this was unhealthy. And I know that. But when you're a kid, you just think you want your parent to love you. You want your parent to recognize you. I was the kid. I never rebelled. And I want to say that humbly. I was so scared to rebel because I was told God would kill me. I did not rebel. I was constantly asking my parents, how are you doing? How are you feeling? I was the one that, by the way, and I have to say this, Jon claims to have worked so hard and be successful. Jon had me at the age of 8 until the age that I left, which was 21, and he didn't want me to leave. He tried to keep me from leaving and becoming married. He had me cooking all of his meals every single day. He had me doing all of the house cleaning because, don't you know, according to him, that's what females were made to do. So he had a servant. And when he came to live with me as an adult, he exhibited that same behavior. And he would say, oh, thanks for making the meal. Thanks for doing this. But he would never lift a finger. In fact, up until Trish committed suicide and left, Jon did not know how to shop for groceries in Walmart. And I mean that quite literally. He went for his very first shopping trip by himself in his entire life to Walmart back in 2016, and it took him 4.5 hours to get maybe less than 20 items. And I said to him, "Where did you go? Are you okay?" And he looks at me, he goes, "Well, I didn't know where anything was." I said, "No one takes that long on a shopping trip." He says, "Yeah, well, I just get lost in Walmart. I've just never really been in there because I had you and your mom to do it for me." And Jon, I almost never saw him do any form of housework. The only housework he would do was the masculine tasks, which is ridiculous because there's no masculine tasks, but he would wash the windows and then maybe do a little bit of lawn care, but he had us children do those tasks. Jon and Trish viewed us as personal slaves, and my parents refused to ever help me meet anyone to date or to marry, even though I expressly told them I was interested. Um, my mother forced me into a betrothed relationship with a young man. My parents, in the end, were very Amish and Mennonite like, and I am not slandering the Amish and the Mennonites. I'm simply saying if you want a
Did,
picture of what that looks like. Yeah, go ahead.
did you say that they were trying to force you to marry somebody?
Yes, that's correct. There was a group of people in one of the homeschooling groups in Somerset, and my mother was the main person who actually was forcing me to get married. And Jon did not step in much at all. He'll claim he did, but he was not there to have some adult sense and say, "We're not doing this." But I've heard of a lot of people, and this is actually something important, around 86% or more of females who are raised in these environments by their parents do marry people and they're actually betrothed. And that's a real thing that happens with people like what my parents believe. They're taught by the pearls that betrothal is actually how it should be. I was raised in churches that taught this. A lot of people still believe that betrothal is a real thing, so the parents can have control, and that's it. But I just wanted to say I barely escaped being forced to marry someone, and let me add this: both my parents knew that the dad of the man they were trying to have me marry was a child pornography addict, and not only did they not report him because they knew him, but they thought that it would be fine for me to marry someone who's the child of that without even knowing the man's personal history. Without I had met him 3 times, this young man, and certainly it sounds very ancient. And so Jon will say he protected me from that. That was more Trish, but I want to use this as an example of just how misogynistic and patriarchal Jon is. I was taught that God gives selective gifts to males and females. And I was taught that God would never use a female to be a pastor, to be a speaker, to be a teacher. And there was one Sunday where we were riding in the car to church, and Jon was putting on one of his many, many John MacArthur sermons. I just want to say, in case people wonder how much of a fanatic he is about religion, Jon listened to sermons, and I mean an hour-long sermon, um, about 2 times a day, and on Sundays 3 to 4 times in addition to church. So he sounds very knowledgeable, and since the age of 19 he's listened to many, many, many well-known pastors who have serious problems, and that's where he gets his knowledge from. So he listened to at the expense of us as children. I remember I wasn't important. It was the sermon was important. I wasn't important. The Bible was important. And I remember we always had sermons in our home playing, and that wasn't a positive thing. I'm not commenting on people listening to sermons, but Jon would listen to 2 to 3 sermons a day. Sundays he would listen to about 5. um and so this particular Sunday on the way to church, we were listening to a sermon about women not being pastors. And I remember, now that I was almost 19, feeling like this isn't right. I have to speak up. But I knew I couldn't speak my mind because he would threaten me and get dangerous. And so this went worse than I could have imagined. So I'm sitting there, my brother Lane is in the back seat, and again, I'm about 19, and I said, "Dad, why can't women be pastors?" And I said it in that way to purposely make it sound like I wasn't causing a confrontation. Jon quickly turns off the radio and he just like glares at me and looks at me like, "How dare you ask that question?" And I'm going, "Oh, I'm not liking the sense I'm getting about this right now." He goes, "Well, why would you ask that?" And I said, well, I'm just curious. I just want to know, like, why can't women do this? He goes, why? Because you want to do it too? He goes, because you want to be in abject rejection and rebellion against God? Is that why? And keep in mind, I'm just sitting here ready for church. We're just driving. Like I'm kind of in shock going, what is happening right now? And then he proceeds to cut me off when I'm trying to explain myself, as he always does with everyone. And he proceeds to say, oh, I see how it is. All right. So you want to challenge me. Is that how this is? Your dad, who has all this Greek knowledge, all this Bible knowledge, you want to challenge me? You think you're ready for that? And I knew he was trying to intimidate me. So I took a breath, I gathered my thoughts, and I was like, he's not going to intimidate me. And for the first time, and this might shock some people that I couldn't actually say this for the first time, but this is how dangerous it was. I want to add a quick side note and say, from the time I was 8 years old, my parents threatened to kill me with a gun. My parents threatened to kill my brothers, and they threatened to make me homeless in the wintertime and put me on the streets. And in our town, we did not have a bus system that would be able to take us to a place that was safe. And so I would have no way to get to where I needed to go. They threatened to put us in foster care. So imagine me, and yes, I'm 19, but when you go through that, you're just not, you feel like you're enslaved. And so I felt unsafe to even say something. So I said, for the first time in my life, well, you know, what if God views this differently? What if this is how could God claim to care about women and yet subject them? The look on his face was so scary. You would have thought that I had threatened him with a gun or something extremely serious. He goes completely red in the face. He takes his eyes off of the highway where we're going 70 miles an hour, and he takes his eyes intentionally off the road with a dramatic turn of his head and just keeps his hands on the wheel and glares at me with a red face. And the intent behind that was, I'm not looking back at this road until you recant what you just said. And I'm looking at the road. We're starting to swerve off the road to the right. We're in the right lane. So we're starting to head toward the edge of the road. And I'm getting scared. And I'm like, he means this. And now this is no longer about belief. Now this is my dad is threatening me because I disagree with him. And so he quickly looks back at the road, but it was this, he had the sneer on his face, like, I scared her. Maybe that'll work. And now I'm getting mad inside. And I'm like, oh, I see what kind of a devil you are. I know exactly what you're trying to do. So I knew I had to proceed with caution, but he wasn't going to let this go. So normally I would have been quiet and not said anything, and I would have been like, this isn't even worth it. But he's not going to let this go. So now he begins to be a absolute bully and terrifying. And he begins to yell and slam the steering wheel while we're driving and take the steering wheel in both hands and yank it left and right and left and right. And before he did that, he purposely looked in his left and rear view mirror to make sure there were no cars around, because he knew what he was going to do before he did that. And he starts swerving. He says, and then he screams at me, do you know I could send you to heaven to meet the God that you're denying right now? You're so lucky I'm a good dad and I love you, or I could send you somewhere where you don't want to be. And at that moment, I realized he's a murderer. He is like a Ted Bundy. There's something about him that is extremely, extremely unhinged. And Lane is in the back, and I happen to glance in the rear view mirror because I'm in the front passenger seat, and he has these huge eyes. He looks so scared. And I remember Lane looking right at me with these eyes of help. What is going on right now? And I knew that Lane was like, there's something wrong with this person. And Jon then goes completely silent and he's breathing heavily. He's threatening me. And I'm just quiet because I'm going, okay, I don't want to poke the bear right now. And he then starts talking the entire next 30 minutes about all about why women aren't able to be human, really. And then he never discussed it. Oh, and then the rest of that day, he put on 4 sermons for me to listen to show me why I was wrong and to make sure I knew never to ask that question again. And that's what he would do. He would have Lane and me write for hours as young children, handwrite Bible verses, whole chapters, whole books of the Bible. And if you've ever read a Bible, you know it's a lot. And that was our punishment for lying. Quote, lying. I just want to say we rarely lied as children. It was to simply keep ourselves safe. In a terroristic hostage situation, it's not a lie. It's a life-saving defense. And we were given chunks and chunks until our parents would know that they were done punishing us once we had blisters and a cramped hand and we were crying and we weren't allowed to eat. We weren't allowed to do anything. That's how they disciplined us. And that was the mild version of discipline. I want to clarify that. They made us do cursive because they knew it was uncomfortable and hard. Cursive handwriting. And we would write chapters and chunks and books of the Bible. And then we were made to have another 6 to literally 12-hour conversation, meaning we were up for sometimes 48 hours with no sleep as young children while my dad sat and yelled and screamed at us and told us we were horrible human beings and made us sit sweaty and hungry with no food, not able to go use the bathroom, and would talk to us about stuff about the Bible, about God. It's so hard for me to explain. People would not even believe the kind of stuff that he would say. But it was stuff like, do you want to end up dead and in hell? Let me tell you how you're so horrible. Let me tell you how God views you. Let me tell you the extent to which you're such a loser. And I'm telling you, I was receiving this at age 8 to 10. My brother would have been 6, and my youngest brother would have been 3 or 4. We were all three at that age. And I'm very protective of my younger brothers. We were all three made to sit there, not move, not muscle. And if we moved a muscle, if we made a facial expression that wasn't one of intense staring into his eyes, and he would beat us if we did not look in his eyes the entire time. He would move his chair within 3 inches of our face, spitting in our face because he was talking so close, screaming and yelling at us. And I'm saying when my brother was 3, I've never ever heard of any situation, and maybe there are other people that have been unfortunate enough to experience that. But the reason Jon, and this is going to sound so bizarre, the reason Jon was so poor all the time and could not build businesses and was so unsuccessful is because he was at home screaming at his kids, starving them, refusing to let them get off the futon in the special den slash library study that he had. And he would prison us on this futon, take his rolling chair, move it within inches of our face, and for 12 hours, sometimes longer, 2 to 3 times a week or more for years, would just say the most horrible things, would go to the whiteboard we had in this library and diagram the Bible, diagram how God treated people, diagram. He has these diagrams on his website. They're just strange. And you can go to his website and see these. And he would put these up on the computer and talk to us for hours. And again, my brother is 3, he's 4. So I just feel such horror to know he went through that at that young age. And I think he's blocked it out. I've tried to talk to him about this, and he doesn't want to have anything to remember. And I understand that completely, but it was so traumatizing. I don't think he realizes how traumatizing it was. Um, and if we moved our face, it sounds very strange. My dad would watch us. He would go, "Why is your eye twitching like that? What are you saying about me?" He'd go, "Why is your lip moving? Why is your cheek moving?" And then he would start yelling at us in military terms, slamming the wall, slamming his foot until we looked scared and started crying. He would do it over and over and over, like 20 times until we looked scared and started crying. And then he would suddenly, the creepiest, it's so creepy, go quiet and just look at us with a smirk on his face and go, "Are you ready to listen now? Is that enough, or do I need to give you more? Because I will." And he would, hours, years of this. And I'm just going to say this. I don't know any other person that treats their children that way and then claims to help other people. And I want people to hear me getting teared up and upset about this because it was so real. And I don't want anyone saying she's lying, she's making this up. They're free to say that. People are free to think what they want. But I want people to know the reason why I believe God has given me this opportunity to speak is because I went through such hell. It was unbelievable. I have had such trauma and scars. It's been 11 years that I have been healing, and I still have so much more healing to go. And when you're told you are nothing, you are no one, God hates you, you deserve horrible things. My parents would tell us at little ages, knowing we were afraid of the dark. They purposely made us scared. They told us that they would pray that demons would haunt us and would punish us if we didn't respect our parents. They told us that demons would follow us our entire adult lives and affect our children and our spouses. They told us that, and this is Trish and John, I want to be clear about this. They used John MacArthur in sermons and these pastors that have evil beliefs It would tell us that only they get to speak with God on our behalf. I remember conversation after conversation. I was just talking with someone last night about this, of them telling me, I know exactly your life plan. God has told me. And so you can't tell me what your life plan is. I remember when I was a young 8-year-old, when I was 10, I genuinely felt that I was supposed to do something with my life. And I told them, and they proceeded to sit down for hours and tell me why I was wrong. Remember that same thing happening when I was 14, when I was 16. And then I just gave up and I was like, this is not safe. I'm not telling them. And where most children would be like, encouraged and would be excited to tell mom and dad, this is what I'm doing with my life. And Jon portrays this in these inappropriate videos. And I want to get back to that. He posted on X, on Twitter, private photos, private videos. By the way, when I moved, he gave me photos that I never asked for, and he told me to keep them for him. And I want to tell him, I've thrown all those away, Dad. They're all gone. They're all in the trash because, and home movies, he gave me all the home movies. So I would be poisoned to remember how, quote, good of parents they were. But yet, with photos and videos, those were all fake. Not a single photo and video was one where I was really happy. And I want to say that I was faking it to keep the family happy. I was the one that was the peacemaker. I was the one that kept my brother safe. I was the one that helped my family. I was the one that was, unfortunately, that trauma survivor that thinks they can save people. And now I think very differently. And I just want to say, Jon and Trish purposely took every tactic they could think of. And I want to also add this. Jon took all of the things that he studied about trauma survivors, about hostages. Oh, and he was really into hostages. He was fascinated. I remember him watching for hours on the news about hostage situations, about people that work with hostages. He would use those mind control tactics on his own children. The kinds of torture is not even used by the Pearls. The kind of torture is not even used by many of the methods I'm familiar with. They used all of those and more. And my parents, you will hear a very few select evil people do this, where they will actually learn from other offenders how to abuse, and they'll become even better at it. And this is going to sound very strange to people who see Jon. They're like, he looks like a very nice, smart guy. And I would say 100%, and don't you believe it? All of that is a fake. All of that is a ruse. He wants you to think that. And I know that because he would tell us, he would say, I've almost got them. They really think this about me. And it might sound hard to believe that someone would actually be that sick and twisted. But if you have never experienced that level of evil, most people, and I want to give credit to people for this, most people have not experienced that level of evil. So it sounds hard to believe. And I understand that. I have heard other survival stories, and sometimes I'm tempted to go, I think they might be making that up. But let me just tell you, when you look at people that are extremely dangerous in their psychology, they have ways of thinking that we can't even imagine. And unfortunately, Jon uses what I've just said and says, well, I'm an expert in that. And I want to say, oh, you're an expert, all right. You've practiced that. That's who you are. The abuse that Trish put us through was worse than Jon. And Jon knew, and I brought that to him over years and years, and he didn't do anything. And he told me, we can't say anything because people are going to undermine me. People are going to view me as allowing it to happen. I thought, well, you darn well know it, don't you? You're telling me you know your cover would be blown. I wonder why. Perhaps because you'd be guilty by association by being the dad. And everyone knows if you're an adult, and I'm going to say this, I know plenty of couples where the wife or the husband knew about abuse, sexual abuse, and allowed it to continue, and they both went to prison. And that's what should happen to Jon. 100%. If you know what's happening and you do not speak up and you do not step forth and protect your children, and you stay married to someone like that, you are worthy of much worse things than prison. But I'm just going to say prison is the nicest, least worst thing that could happen to him. And so for Jon to say, I'm going to put out private photos and videos of my children on YouTube without consent and make it look like I still have contact with them. By the way, Jon has no contact with me and with Reed. We both have nothing to do with him. And I know that because Reed has told me. My middle brother, Lane, is currently being held hostage. And I want to make this clear. He is being held hostage by Trish's parents and family. And I have tried to rescue him and I cannot. I have involved law enforcement and I cannot. And Jon knows this. Jon wants them to keep him because Lane was so tortured by them that he has gone through so much. And Jon will do nothing about that. And so I am missing my younger brother. For all I know, he could be dead. I don't know what has happened to him. And I have done everything in my power to rescue my brothers. I was a fighter for them. I told Jon in 2016 after I saw how unstable he was. After I saw what he did with the prison, this was directly because of the prison. I told him, could I be a guardian for Lane and Reed? And I said that because I could tell after he lost his job, he was about to abandon us because I've seen those signs in him before. Because he can't keep a job, he can't be consistent and faithful. And I said, in the interest of helping my brothers, I said, I want to be a legal guardian for my youngest brother, Reed, since he's underage. And since my brother Lane has those mental health issues that I know why he's acting that way. I understand Lane would tell me things. He would tell me why he was acting that way. He trusted me. And I said, I want to be a legal guardian. And Jon surprisingly said, sure. Is that what you want? I mean, imagine a dad giving his children away to his oldest daughter, who's only 20. And I said, at the time, I felt like that was my duty. And I said, yes. I said, I want to go to court. I said, I will do whatever it takes. And Jon didn't bat an eye at that. Jon was more than happy to let me take them from him. And then here's what happened. And then we never went through the guardian process because he wanted to keep Lane and Reed in his name. And so what he did was he just abandoned them with me. So no, I don't have the status of guardian where I could have filed for help from the state, where I could have had financial assistance. He just abandoned me with them. And this is when he says, and he's going to come out and say, Nicole is betraying me, how many things I did for her, how much I supported her financially. No, what he did was he paid to make sure we could keep the lights on while I took care of my brothers. He gave us basic financial assistance, and he considers that. Keep in mind, he's never helped his first and only at the time grandchild. He now has another one. He has never supported me. He refused. He told me he refused to pay for college. He never paid for college. So to this day, I am still struggling to get my career underway. I joined on my own colleges over 8 times and had to drop out because of how much stress I was under. He did the same thing with Lane and Reed. Now, all 3 of his children are uneducated. And let me just talk about the hypocrisy for a second. Jon's parents, Lou and Cindy Uhler, they paid for every single one of their children to get a 4-year bachelor degree. Jon had his degree. And I want to say how ridiculous this is. Jon had such terrible grades in college and in high school because he was goofing around. His family's told me this. Jon has told me this. He was not focused. He thought he could go and do all these extracurricular activities and not study. It got so bad, he had to switch 1 and 2 colleges. And one college told him, if you don't raise your grade from D's, we're kicking you out. And Jon will say, look how many, and this is the real story. Jon puts in his bio, look how many colleges and universities I have been to. And the reason for that is because he couldn't stay in them. And he didn't even know that his credits couldn't transfer from one university, so he had to start back all over again. And I remember saying, how did you not know that? How did you not know that your credits weren't transferable? He said, well, no one ever told me. I said, that's kind of common knowledge. And you didn't know that? And you were clarifying he was in his mid-20s at that time. He had taken so long to go through college. I think it took him 6 to 8 years to get a bachelor's, which was paid for the whole way by his parents. The only reason, and I want to say this, the only reason Jon is actually a therapist who has a degree is because his parents paid for it. Otherwise, he would be a worker with his hands, which he despises, and he would be doing the same thing as the people he can't stand. He is blessed by his parents to have a degree. And yet he told me flat out, he and my mom told me, we will not pay for your college. You can work for it just like every other American. Otherwise, you're going to be spoiled. And I'm not having that. I'm like, oh, and you're not spoiled for having your parents pay for a degree. So the reason he got a college degree at multiple universities is because he couldn't stick with a university. He didn't know how to study. He kept failing and he kept transferring. So it's not a positive thing. And then when he couldn't make up his mind about what he wanted to be, he switched from pastor to therapist simply because it was easier, because he couldn't do the linguistics of being a pastor. He kept failing out of those classes. So instead of admitting that, he says, oh, I went to this school. No, you couldn't handle it, so you switched. And then after switching, he still complained his butt off. And I remember being young when he was finishing up his master's degree. And keep in mind, he only had to pay for 2 years of school. But because he had squandered his savings and he was so poor, and he refused to leave Southern California, even though it was extremely expensive, because he wanted to start a counseling network. So he made us become poor. We were very poor. We hardly had any money. We never bought anything new. And when I say poor, I mean there were many times when my parents didn't know where food was coming from. It was really bad. And so Jon purposely did not work on any financial support at all. And he would play a shyster and he would try to get people to give him money. And that's one of the things that he's always done. So his parents never taught Jon to work. The only jobs Jon has ever had, and I am saying this on record, Jon, according to his own words, has ever worked at an ice cream shop as a teenager and newspaper delivery. And then at one of his other jobs, he was a tow truck driver for about 3 months. Those are the jobs he's had. And he proceeds to tell his own daughter what a failure she's going to be because she can't keep a job. He's told me that many times. He's proceeded to criticize everyone else. And he does this with everyone because they don't have a high level degree like, quote, he has. And so his parents paid. He wouldn't have that if his parents didn't pay. He complained his butt off and says his master's degree of 2 years made him poor. He says that's the reason he isn't successful today. And after getting his master's, he didn't know how to start a counseling network and he struggled for years until we moved to Pennsylvania. And it was only because of the prisons, only because of the prisons that he looks legit. And those were the setup for where he gets his claims. So before the prisons, he was a mess. He didn't understand how things work. He didn't take the time to research the fields. He didn't take the time to ever find out, is this a good fit? He would just jump in blindly and then he'd blame everybody else for his problems. He'd blame everyone else for not being prepared. And that's his pattern is if he finds out that he doesn't know something, instead of admitting that like a normal grown adult, he blames everybody else. And this is what he did with Jimmy. This is what he does with everybody. He says, let's start a business together. What he means is you're going to do all the work. You're going to take care of everything because I don't know how to. But instead of admitting that, he's going to make you feel like you're so grateful to be here. And aren't you so special? And Jimmy told me he experienced this, where Jon would use these nice words saying, oh, aren't you so glad we're working together? Man, we make such a great team. And it's such manipulative, magician-like behavior to do a sleight of hand move with your words to distract from the fact that he has no idea how to do stuff. And since it's funny to me, since Jon continuing to be fired for being nosy in other people's businesses in South Carolina, where he is right now, he has not been able to get his business off the ground because he doesn't know how to. And I know that because he's told me. And Jon throws a pity party, acts like a spoiled child. And to be clear, his whole family, his brothers, his parents raised them that way. All his brothers are spoiled children, so he is no different. But it's very hypocritical of him to act better than them, to act different. And so when Jon screamed at me and said, "Can you imagine me working in a job where I feel less than?" I thought, wow, that just speaks volumes. And I'm so glad he said that to me because now I know exactly that's what's kept me from having a relationship is hearing him say that really was the last straw that I needed. Just say, this man is a completely he thinks he's king. He has a very dangerous mindset. And so what I want to end with is Jon will use whatever means are necessary to force people to do what he wants. He, anytime someone gets involved with Jon, they end up getting hurt. Every single person. And if they're not hurt yet, it's either because, unfortunately, they don't know who they're dealing with, or they don't want to see it. And I'm thankful. I'm so thankful to hear after growing up with what I did. And by the way, as I said before, we had no families. We never got together with people. I did not have friends. I had one friend, but my family picked her out for me. And it's funny, and I want to say this, we're still friends to this day, and we both went through the same kind of crap from both our parents, and we are abuse survivors, and we're proud of it, and we don't talk to our parents either. So it's funny to me that they thought that the two of us would be great friends so that we could stay in this clique together, and it backfired. And I just want to say, for all of the people that have been abuse survivors in this toxic, gothard, fundamental cult that is rampant in many churches in the US, specifically Southern Baptist and denominations that believe in fundamentalism and biblical counseling. People like that are not safe. And they will not. And I want to say the biggest thing that I've noticed in looking at quite a few different people who believe this, they will never disclose to you that they believe this, and they'll lie to you. They have no problem lying to you. And so Jon speaks on behalf of many people who also believe that. And it's so scary to me, though. The biggest thing is females need to know that they are worthy in the sight of God. They are beautiful, they are enough. And Jon doesn't believe that. Jon believes that he gives you value. Jon has that megalomaniac perspective that you're there for his purposes. He targets women. He's targeted me simply because of my gender. Jon refuses to see me as a whole person. Jon refuses to see me as an adult. And that's so concerning that you would parentify your children, that you would have an incestuous relationship with your daughter specifically. Jon, in fact, discarded, and I noticed this, and I didn't have words for this. Jon discarded my brothers because they weren't female. And he latched on to me, but then threw me away when I don't serve him anymore. And then Jon, as soon as, and we'll talk about this later, as soon as Trish left, he immediately got involved with trying to find another quote life partner because he doesn't want to be alone and he wants someone to take care of him, do the dishes, cook. And that's exactly what, and if Susan ever hears this, that's what you're being used to do. You're being used to serve him. You're not his friend. And so I'm very proud to speak out and say, don't be deceived by Jon. He knows exactly what he's doing. And I hope that the people that have been hurt can hear this and some light bulbs can go on for them.
We will be back next week with part 2.